Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I was preparing to feed a couple of my red wiggler bins, and I was just kind of looking at my whole setup here, and I kind of came to a realization that I didn't really notice until just a moment ago. And it's the fact that I've um I've got what I always consider to be my primary type of worm that I use for my worm composting, spread out over a number of bins. It's the top three containers on the top shelf, as well as the one in the middle on the on the second shelf. And that makes four containers that have red wigglers in them. But now that I'm looking at it, I've also got one, two, three, and even the bag, four, right? I've actually got four systems now that have night crawlers in them. So I always kind of treated the night crawlers as sort of an outlier, as a almost like an anomaly, an aberration in my worm composting environment. But as of not too long ago, ever since I launched off a couple new bins in order to have a second African nightcrawler bin, and more recently now to have a secondary European nightcrawler bin, I've actually now gotten my nightcrawler population up to the point where it's almost equal to my red wiggler population. And I say almost because I do know for a fact that the red wiggler bins are far more densely populated than the nightcrawler bins. But, that's kind of a technicality, I think, because in time I'm sure that that'll change if I continue to kind of split my populations and give them space to breed and multiply. So I just thought I would bring that to everyone's attention in case you've been following along, or maybe you've even noticed it at this point, even before I did. um, so whatever, I just wanted to get back on track. It's the one here in the middle, and it's the one here in the upper right. They're the ones that are due for feeding. It's been a week now since they last got fed, and if I'm not mistaken, the food that they got was not even that much, so I'm probably not going to find a lot of leftovers in there from the last feeding, but we'll see when we get them up on the bench to give them today's portion. So let's get to work. So we're going to begin with the newer of the two red wiggler bins, and this one is the 43-day-old bin. That makes it over a month and a week old at this point, so it's not even that new anymore. I will have newer red wiggler bins launching off in the near future, because I've got my two older, these are the two younger of my red wiggler bins. I've got the two older of my red wiggler bins in the process of the worms being depopulated. So I've set up migrations in those, hoping that the worms are going to depopulate the finished castings in short order. And at some point, once the worms have moved out of the finished castings and into this sort of separate special feeding zone that I've created for them, I'll be able to start scooping them out and using them to launch off new red wiggler bins. So I will have newer red wiggler bins coming soon, but as of now, this is the newest. And I'm just removing some of the materials here on top, give us access to the bin itself. Last time I was in here, I used some of my autumn leaves from outside. In most cases, when I'm using leaves, I just go right to these old crushed dry leaves that have been sitting outside in a leaf collection bag for years, actually, at this point. But I figured now that I've got some really beautiful, colorful leaves outside, I was going to just bring some of them in and use them as bedding. Really as a kind of a top cover, but definitely as bedding. So it's just a matter of time before these start getting broken down as well. And you can see worm tracks everywhere, and also some obvious signs of collecting moisture from that plastic that was originally covering things that I took off before. I really like the way that produces a nice cozy, damp environment for the worms. I mean, these leaves are, have a nice moisture content to them. They were nice and dry when I bought them in. They'd been sitting, outside on the ground for a while. And by putting them in here, the recirculating moisture within the bin, caused by that plastic covering, does create a nice moist place in these leaves for the worms to want to even come up and explore. Because you definitely saw a few worms hanging out within these leaves already. And if they were really dry, they wouldn't be there. So that's kind of what I was after, and I like the way it looks, I like the way it's working. So I'm going to do my best to try to preserve this top covering of autumn leaves so we can continue to have them covering things up top here after we feed and we start closing up things here. I just thought I would take this as a quick opportunity to see how things are progressing in this bin in general. And I typically like to use the outer edges, the outskirts of the bin, furthest away from where the feedings and the moisture have been getting added, to see how things are holding up. If things start going dry in the bin, those are the spots in most cases where you're going to observe that dryness happening. So when I'm running a new bin like this, I do treat each feeding as a sort of an injection of additional moisture on top of what's in the bin already. And I do also try to see what sort of a concentration of castings I'm starting to observe within the material compared to the original kind of carbonish material that were used to build the bin. You know, scraps of cardboard, which we can clearly see evidence of here, a lot of the leafy matter that was used to build the bin. But in time, all of this compost that's mixed in with it starts to dominate, you know. And as it does, that stuff has a much greater capability of holding on to the moisture in the bin than all of this stuff that allows for a lot of airflow, that sheds its moisture quite readily and dries off really easily. So in time, I'll probably get to a point where I feel that the moisture in the bin has kind of gotten to the point where it's not only ideal for the worms, but also such that it can maintain its moisture level on its own because of the material that makes up the bin at that point, which would be, at that point, more castings than bedding type material. So I've been using that as my sort of my gauge to determine if it's time to give the bin a little bit more airflow by not covering up with plastic anymore. And I don't think we're quite at that point yet. I guess other signs of excess moisture could be the sort of the outbreak of certain types of little creepy crawlies in the bin that thrive on a lot of moisture. And I believe that was the main reason in the other bin that we're going to be feeding today, the slightly older one. We had started seeing signs of possibly excess moisture building up in that bin, not only by the dampness of the material itself, but also by the presence of a great number of what I think are springtails cruising around throughout the material, little creepy crawly white creatures, so small you could barely see them. But if you kind of slow down and you just look, you could see them all zipping around in there, taking advantage of the moisture. So when we get to the other bin that we're feeding today, we're not going to find plastic covering it. We're going to find only a piece of newspaper, which is set up that way by design in the hopes that the moisture level in the bin will start to gradually decrease by the moisture being left to evaporate out of the bin. And I'm starting to wonder if we might be approaching that point in this bin too. I don't see the springtail outbreak sort of situation happening here, so I don't feel like I've got to react necessarily and do it as a reaction to what I feel is sort of an invasion almost. Although it's not really an invasion, because bottom line is that they're in your bin whether you notice them or not. Their numbers just really increase greatly when there's an abundance of food and moisture. So I just don't want to let things get to that point where suddenly I start seeing more of them in the bin than I would like to see. I'm now picking through the middle, now that we've had a chance to sort of inspect the material in the bin, how it looks on the outskirts. And you're going to see a lot of large leaves, you know. I used a lot of these leaves not only as top cover to make things pretty, but I also used them as the bedding to sprinkle down into the feeding zone before I applied the food. A lot of times I'll use stuff that's a little bit smaller, you know, like those small fine chopped leaves in that box that I showed you earlier, or, you know, some other form of carbon rich bedding material like paper or cardboard or something like that. So that's the reason we're seeing lots of large leaves throughout this container. And they'll all break down in time. It's just these larger sticks, the sticks of the really huge leaves, that make me wonder how long they're going to last. I could see them potentially needing to get picked out at some point in the future if they don't break down as quickly as one would hope. So this bin's got a really nice, healthy population. You can see worms pretty much cruising around everywhere. I definitely saw a few signs of the last feeding. I didn't really pinpoint them or point them out when we stumbled on them, but you may have noticed little scraps of green leafy stuff. I believe this would be a little scrap of the last feeding. Certainly not much. And I believe that that was my thinking too, was when I fed this bin last a week ago, was that the material was kind of a soft, leafy stuff, which would probably not last very long. So I think I've gotten back into here just in the nick of time, because the bin probably is due for a quick feeding. And today's feeding is going to be another material that I think is going to break down pretty quickly, but you know, it's always a little bit uncertain how the worms are going to react to different types of feedings. Sometimes you think they're going to just gobble up what you've given them, and then weeks later it's still there. Other times you're kind of surprised at how quickly what you've given them vanishes. So the material that they're getting today in their feeding is just a mixed bag of different stuff out of my freezer, mostly fruits, like the peelings from apples, apple cores. You can see some banana skins in there that I've broken. They were very easy to break since they were frozen. There's also veggies in there. There's bits of celery and carrots and stuff like that. So it's a pretty good mixture. And it's also a pretty good amount too. So I'm going to use all of this to feed these two bins today. And I've also got some newspaper here that I've kind of put into little strips. So I thought that I'd use a little bit of that as additional bedding just to get rid of it down here in the feeding zone. So yeah, why don't we start piling in some of the stuff that we plan on feeding today. The other thing I've got set aside over here I did not show is some used coffee as well. So not only is it going to be an abundant amount of kitchen scraps in terms of frozen fruits and veggies, I'm also going to pile in a little bit of used coffee too. So let's go ahead and grab a couple handfuls here. If you've been a regular on my channel, you'll notice that I was recently starting to use this process where you take sheets of newspaper, an entire sheet of newspaper, and take the food that you're giving them and wrap them into these little bundles. I got a little bit of feedback on that yesterday, which I was a little surprised at, but no, maybe not too surprised. People were saying, you know, hey, rather than doing what you did, and if you watched yesterday's video, if you didn't, I could put a link to it in the corner. I had taken these little bundles of food and I had pre-built them, so I kind of got into a little bit of a production line, and I was going to feed a number of bins, so I figured I would bundle up these food packages for them really quick in advance, so that when it came time to, you know, feed the worms, I could just drop them in 1, 2, 3. But I've learned since then, through the feedback a couple people have left for me, is that people just prefer to, you know, watch me add the food, so that you can actually get a better look at what's being placed in here as food for the worms. So it's not to say that I'm going to stop creating bundles in which to put the worm food, but I figured today I would just skip it. I just thought that it might be a good idea, since I had 4 containers to feed yesterday. I thought it would help speed things along a little bit if I had kind of pre-built those food packages, so that when I got into each bin to feed them, that I'd be able to just kind of get in and out a little bit more efficiently. So it was just something I was trying, and I was appreciative of the feedback that I got from everybody about it. So this bin is really looking nice. Definitely like the progress it's making. Not bad for, you know, something that's not even a month and a half old yet. The material down low is definitely starting to break down nicely. all of these leaves that just got piled in last time a week ago are going to take time. I've started adopting this new thinking that says, hey, you know, you don't want to put leafy matter in, mainly because of the time it takes for the sticks to break down. The leaf itself will get broken down 1, 2, 3, but it's all that stick litter, you know. All these little tiny stems of the leaves end up sticking around in your bin for a long time. You've got a bin full of what appears to be nice finished castings ready to go almost. And then you feel like you've got to give the bin a little bit more time just to let the worms break all that stuff down too. So I'm going to try to use fewer leaf bits and leafy material in my bins as the bins get more mature. But since these bins are still fairly young, I'm thinking it's still okay to use leaves in these. So let's see here. Back goes the coffee filter. Coffee filter in my case usually just indicates where I fed. Although if you're a regular here, you'll know that I almost always feed down the middle anyway. But sometimes if I decide it's time to feed elsewhere, I'll just use these coffee filters to indicate where I had last fed. It doesn't require me to go kind of on a wild goose chase to figure out where I had last fed. So even though I most always know where that happened last time, I like to also mark it occasionally if I don't forget. Almost out of tradition at this point. So that looks really good. All right, so we're going to go feed the other of my 2 younger red wiggler bins, but that'll be the older one. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 70 or so days. Let's go grab that one now. Okay, so this bin is, to be a little bit more precise, it's actually 73 days of age at this point. And as I mentioned earlier, we're not covering up with plastic here. We've got obviously a fairly dry piece of newspaper covering things here. You can hear just from the way it moves. And even this coffee filter, which indicates where we last fed, is rather dry too. And that's by design. And it's because in previous feedings we were starting to observe a lot of little creepy crawly creatures buzzing around in this bin. I wasn't even sure what the heck they were, and I think based on feedback, people that have made comments, we've kind of determined that they are probably springtails. And if we see them again today, I'm going to continue giving this bin a chance to air out and shed some of its excess moisture, if it still seems like it has excess moisture. But I think even last week we were starting to notice that it was starting to look really nice already, and that the springtail infestation seemed to have been reduced, and that maybe it wasn't really necessary anymore to be concerned about it. But I don't remember, so we're going to try to refresh our memory just by checking out things in here. But I believe, you know, at first glance, it does look like things look pretty nice in here. I don't think I see any springtail creepy crawlies, at least not as many as I had observed in the past. I am, on the other hand, noticing, you know, cocoons here and there. I'm noticing what appears to be a cocoon, unless I'm mistaken. I'm pretty sure that's a cocoon. Over here, too, I'm seeing a couple of them. One's really dark in color. The other one's a little lighter, maybe visible on my glove there. It's always a good sign to see that the worms are mating, reproducing, increasing their numbers, setting us up for the next generation. Now when I peel back, it's usually when I peel back and I get down to the slightly more moist material right below the surface is when I start seeing signs of the little creepy crawlies, and I definitely see signs of them in here. I'm not sure if the camera's picking them up or not, but I do, I still see them creeping around, but they don't seem to be quite as high in numbers or as dense in population as they had been in the past. I mean, I clearly reacted last time I saw them by, you know, wanting to dry things off in the bin to see if I could reduce their numbers. And I think it's working. But even as I, you know, probed through the material itself, at least over where the feedings had occurred, it was starting to seem to me already like it was still a bit damp and muddy, just from the way the stuff is sticking together. Although, just from that first scoop I took from the outer edge over here, which is the most distant from where the food had been last applied, it seemed like the material was a little bit more flaky, a little bit more dry than it is in the middle. A little bit more the way I would like it to be throughout the bin. So it's a good sign of things to come, I believe. I believe this is really where it's headed. The entirety of the bin would be ideally, kind of like this. So it's a good sign. It's pretty much what I was expecting to see. So, if things had really gone off the rails and started looking way different from what I was expecting, then I would, maybe try to adjust course a little bit. But I think what's happening here is what was intended. So I think I'm going to continue with what I had started here, which is just to continue covering up the way I had in the past and give the material in this bin a little bit more opportunity to continue drying. This is the other sign that it's too wet, I mean, in the other bin, I don't think we saw this where the stuff was really sticking to your glove as much as this. But when it sticks to your glove this much, it's usually a sign that things are maybe a little bit too damp in the bin. Let's take a quick glance over on this edge too, really quick, as long as we're inspecting things. Hopefully we'll see more of the same. Here it even looks like it's even more dry in a way. And I still see signs of the creepy crawlies, I think. But, I don't know. Not too bad. You have to sort of expect that there's things in your bin other than your worms that are all contributing to the breakdown of the food. And, I think most of us know that a really important part of it is the microbes and the bacteria and the fungus and everything that really paves the way for the worms to be able to break the food down. But a lot of times you'll find other little creatures inhabiting your bin, and it's usually not a reason to react harshly or feel like you've got to eliminate them 1, 2, 3. It's often a better point of view to have, to consider them as just helpers, helpers in the process, companions to the worms, and contributors to the process of breaking down the material within your bin. So that's generally my thinking. Obviously there's the types of creatures that you don't want in your bin, the ones that actually prey on the baby worms or the cocoons, stuff like centipedes and stuff, but I've got leaves spilling out all over the place. That's alright, we'll scoop them back into the bin when we're ready to cover things up again here. But now I just want to open up another spot like we did in the other bin, down the middle this time, so we can apply today's feeding. And since the last feeding occurred down here, this is where we're going to expect to see the larger number of worms. The outskirts of the bin did have, signs of worms hanging out, but here where the food was applied is where we're clearly seeing the greatest amount of activity. I'm pretty sure that these pieces of cantaloupe rind have been in here for a number of weeks, and you can see they've stripped clean the inner portion of it where all the meaty, fleshy part of the melon was, but they're still working the tougher outer husk of the melon, and they'll eat it all in time. It's just that tougher stuff's going to require them to have a little bit more time to break it down. So I like the way things look in this bin for sure. You could see I did the same thing here too. I had used a lot of these beautiful fall, autumn leaves as my bedding for the last feeding. So I've got large chunks of leafy stuff in this bin that's going to need time to break down. But at some point soon, since this is already, I guess a 2.5-month-old bin, I might want to start considering using softer bedding type materials. I don't think I'm going to be adding leaves to this one any longer. I think from this point forward, if I feel I need to add bedding, I'll be using a type of bedding, such as this newspaper, stuff that I know is a lot softer and a lot easier for the worms to break down in a much shorter period of time without leaving all kinds of debris throughout the castings, delaying the completion of the bin's life cycle. So, yeah, definitely damp in here. Definitely going to benefit from continued access to the air by only covering, with that piece of paper. So I think that's good. And this loose, leafy stuff on top too, I think that also helps provide a little bit of airflow in between all of it to allow a lot of the moisture to evaporate off the surface. So for now, I think things are going in the right direction. So I'm not going to make any changes at this point. I'm simply going to continue feeding. And I guess the only change is that we're going to be shifting away from using, you know, a softer, more easily eaten material as bedding going forward in the form of, you know, newspaper rather than leaves, or something else similar that'll probably break down a lot more quickly than the stems of the leaves. So that's pretty nice. I guess we'll just start bringing back some of this material that we peeled back. Get this feeding zone covered up. I kind of like throwing that coffee in on top usually, because the coffee serves as another good kind of scent barrier for the more tasty food that's right below. Ooh, let's make sure that these food bits are down low too before we cover up here. But I typically like to just actually use the finished casting type material as cover too, because there's very little remaining food left in that stuff. Although if need be, the worms can continue to re-ingest their own castings over and over again, at least 6 or 7 times I believe, if they need to, if food supplies start to dwindle. But I think it's less likely to attract pests than, you know, if you have just some really delicious fruits and veggies laying right there on the top surface. Alright, so I'm going to use some of these sort of dry leaves here to try to get some of this casting material off my glove and back into the bin. Also got to pick up all these leaves that have fallen off onto the table. See if I've gotten all of them. I believe I did. Good deal. And I think we're ready to cover back up. Kind of like how these autumn leaves are retaining some of their brilliant colors. It's always kind of a nice little surprise to pop in on your worm bin and find all these brilliant autumn colors to greet you when you check in. Very cool. So I had bought this, you know, box of leaves over here to have it on the ready in case I need it, but I think all the leaves that are already in the bins is sufficient to use as bedding. And that little bit of paper that I had tore it into strips, I believe that was sufficient to be bedding to place under the food in this case, since there was still a good amount of the old leafy bedding that had been placed in there last time. So I like the way things are looking in these bins. I don't think that there's any real reason to change course or do anything other than what we've been doing so far, other than maybe at this point, at least in this bin, you know, withhold the addition of any more leafy material and try to use bedding materials that are a little bit softer and more likely to get broken down in a realistic amount of time, as opposed to just sitting in the bin forever and ever. Oh, I got a little bit of filth on my hands, but no big deal. I'll be rinsing off this glove so I can continue to use it in future. So I'll get my hand clean when I get over there into the sink to clean this off. But other than that, I don't have a lot of cleaning up to do, or putting things away. So I should be done here pretty soon. But since all that cleaning up and putting away is boring, I'm not going to take up your time with that. I'm going to end the video here. But before I do, let me just really quickly say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please remember to give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.